Imagine walking through the corridors of power in a world where a single whisper from a monarch could vanish an entire bloodline from existence. We often look at ancient ruins and marvel at their beauty, but beneath those sun-bleached stones lies a history written in something far more permanent than ink. Across every corner of the globe, from the humid jungles of Mesoamerica to the windswept steppes of Asia and the marble halls of Rome, there have been leaders who pushed the boundaries of human endurance. They weren't just politicians or generals. They were individuals who viewed their subjects as clay to be molded through overwhelming force. Today, we are peeling back the curtain on the most intense rulers in ancient history. These are the men and women who redefined what it meant to hold absolute power, leaving behind legacies that still make historians shiver. Get ready, because we are diving straight into the era of the Iron Fist. We begin our journey in the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, with a man whose name became synonymous with the collapse of his enemies. Ashurbanipal of Assyria was perhaps the most complex ruler of his time. On one hand, he was a scholar who built the world's first great library, collecting thousands of clay tablets. On the other, he was the architect of a psychological campaign so relentless that cities would surrender at the mere sight of his banners. Ashurbanipal understood that to rule an empire as vast and rebellious as Assyria, one had to be more than a king. You had to be a force of nature. When he defeated the Elamites, he didn't just take their land, he erased their identity. He had their sacred groves cut down, their ancient tombs opened, and their salt spread across the fields so nothing would ever grow there again. He made sure that the survivors were reminded of their defeat every single day. His palace walls were decorated with stone carvings showing the results of his victories in graphic detail, serving as a warning to any visiting diplomat. This is what happens when you cross the Lion of Nineveh. Moving across the Mediterranean, we arrive in Rome, a place that produced both the greatest thinkers and the most volatile leaders the world has ever seen. While many think of Nero, it is Caligula who truly represents the absolute peak of unpredictable governance. Caligula started his reign with immense popularity, but something shifted. He began to view himself not as a representative of the gods, but as a god himself. He famously ordered his soldiers to march to the northern shores of Gaul to invade Britain, only to change his mind at the last second and command them to gather seashells, which he claimed were the spoils of his victory over the god Neptune. But behind the eccentricities was a chilling disregard for human dignity. He would frequently host lavish banquets where he would stare down his guests, reminding them that with one nod of his head, he could have any of them removed from this life. He viewed the Senate as a plaything, once threatening to make his horse a consul just to show how little he valued their ancient institutions. His reign was a whirlwind of excess and fear, proving that when a person with absolute power loses their connection to reality, the consequences are felt by everyone from the highest noble to the lowest servant. Now let's head east to ancient China, where we find the man who unified a warring nation through a philosophy of uncompromising law. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, is responsible for the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army. But his path to glory was paved with the removal of anything he deemed a threat to his vision. He believed that people were inherently chaotic and required a rigid system of rewards and punishments to remain orderly. This led to a period where he ordered the burning of countless books that didn't align with his practical, legalist view of the world. Scholars who dared to disagree with his policies were not simply silenced. They were vanished into the earth. Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality, spending the latter half of his life searching for a mythical elixir. Ironically, the very substances he consumed to live forever likely led to his early departure. He left behind an empire that was unified but exhausted by his relentless demands for labor and absolute conformity. In the shadows of the Andes, the Moche civilization of South America practiced a form of rulership that was deeply tied to the supernatural. While we don't have a single name like Caligula or Ashurbanipal, the archaeological evidence of the Lord of Sipan reveals a culture where the elite held the power of life and fate over their people. These rulers were seen as intermediaries between the physical world and the spirit realm. Excavations have shown that their ceremonies involved the large-scale removal of individuals in elaborate rituals designed to appease the gods and ensure the falling of rain or the success of the harvest. The rulers would appear in shimmering gold and turquoise, looking like celestial beings to their followers. To the Moche, the ruler wasn't just a king, he was the guardian of the cosmic balance, and if that balance required the ultimate sacrifice of hundreds of people, it was done without hesitation. The sheer scale of these ritual sites tells a story of a population that lived in awe and terror of their divine leaders. Returning to the Mediterranean, we have to talk about the pharaoh Akhenaten of ancient Egypt. Most pharaohs were traditionalists, but Akhenaten decided to upend over 1,000 years of religious history in a single generation. He abolished the worship of the traditional gods and replaced them with a single deity, the Eton, or the sun disk. He moved the capital to a brand new city in the middle of the desert and declared himself the only person who could communicate with the divine. While this might sound like a peaceful religious shift, it was anything but. He sent out squads to chisel the names of the old gods off temples across Egypt. Thousands of priests and officials who had spent their lives in service to the old ways were suddenly outcasts. Akhenaten's obsession with his new vision led him to ignore the frontiers of the empire, allowing territories to slide away while he focused on his desert city. When he eventually passed away, the Egyptian people were so traumatized by his radical changes that they attempted to erase him from history, literally scratching his face off every monument they could find. He remains a reminder of how a ruler's personal obsession can destabilize an entire civilization. In the lush valleys of the Indus and later the Ganges, we encounter King Ajatashatru of the Magadha Empire. He wasn't content to wait for his turn to lead. According to ancient texts, he removed his own father, King Bimbisara, from the throne and seized power by force. Ajatashatru was a pioneer of military technology, using massive catapults and chariots equipped with swinging blades that would clear a path through enemy lines like a modern-day lawnmower. He was a master of siege warfare and expanded his kingdom through a series of brutal campaigns that lasted for decades. While he later showed remorse and turned toward philosophical teachings, his early years were defined by a ruthless ambition that saw him clash with his own family and neighbors in a desperate bid for total dominance over northern India. His story is one of a man who realized too late that a throne built on force is a very cold place to sit. We cannot discuss brutal rulers without mentioning the Aztecs of Central America, specifically Ahuitzotl. He was the 8th Aztec emperor and the one who expanded the empire to its greatest extent. During the inauguration of the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan, the scale of the ceremonies performed under his command was so massive that it defied belief. For 4 days, the altars were active from sunrise to sunset. Thousands of captives were brought from newly conquered lands to be offered to the gods in a display of power that was meant to show the entire world that the Aztecs were invincible. Ahuitzotl was a brilliant general, but his method of maintaining order was to ensure that his enemies were too broken to ever fight back. He transformed the Aztec capital into a place of shimmering beauty and terrifying intensity, where the scent of coal and flowers mingled with the constant rhythm of ritual drums. As we look at these figures, we have to ask, what drove them? Was it simply a desire for more land, or was it something deeper? For many of these rulers, power was a zero-sum game. They lived in a world where if you weren't the one holding the sword, you were the one under it. There was no middle ground. Ashurbanipal's Assyria was surrounded by enemies on all sides. Caligula's Rome was a den of political assassins. Qin Shi Huang's China had been torn apart by centuries of war before he took over. These leaders weren't born into a vacuum. They were products of their environments, responding to chaos with an even greater level of control. Historians often debate whether these rulers were truly as intense as the records suggest. After all, the winners write the history books. Later Roman historians loved to exaggerate Caligula's madness to make the current emperors look better. The texts describing Ajatashatru were often written by religious groups who wanted to emphasize his later change of heart. However, archaeology doesn't lie. The broken pottery, the mass ritual sites in Moche territory, the charred ruins of cities destroyed by Ashurbanipal, and the literal Great Wall of China all provide physical evidence of the sheer volume of human effort and suffering that these rulers commanded. The psychology of absolute power is a fascinating and dark subject. When a human being is told from birth that they are divine, or that their word is the law of the universe, the brain begins to change. Empathy often fades away, replaced by a cold pragmatism. To Akhenaten, the people of Egypt weren't individuals with families. They were tools to build his city. To Ahuitzotl, captives weren't human beings. They were fuel for the cosmic machine that kept the sun rising. This detachment allowed them to make decisions that we would find unthinkable today. But there is also a strange paradox in their legacies. Many of these intense rulers were also great builders and patrons of the arts. Ashurbanipal's library preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh for us to read today. Qin Shi Huang's unification created the foundations for the modern Chinese state. The Aztec Empire under Ahuitzotl saw incredible advancements in engineering and agriculture. It seems that in the ancient world, Greatness and brutality were often two sides of the same coin. You couldn't have the grand monuments without the forced labor, and you couldn't have the long periods of internal peace without a terrifying force at the top to prevent anyone from starting a rebellion. Let's look more closely at the Assyrian strategy. Ashurbanipal didn't just fight wars, he fought a war of the mind. He knew that if he could convince a city that he was a monster, they might just give up without a fight. He would record his victories in excruciating detail and send messengers to neighboring lands to describe exactly what happened to those who resisted. This saved him time and resources, but it created an atmosphere of constant, low-level dread. People in the Assyrian Empire lived in a state where a knock on the door from a royal official was the most terrifying sound imaginable. It was a system built on the idea that fear is a more effective glue than loyalty. Contrast this with Caligula. His fear wasn't a calculated military strategy. It was a personal, erratic whim. In Rome, the rules were supposed to be different. There were laws, a senate, and traditions. Caligula's brutality came from his refusal to play by those rules. When he removed people from power, it wasn't because they were rebels, but because they had annoyed him at dinner or because he wanted their property. This kind of unpredictable behavior is actually more destabilizing for a civilization than the calculated force of an Ashurbanipal. When people don't know the rules, they can't obey them, and the entire social structure begins to fray. In ancient China, Qin Shi Huang's approach was the ultimate expression of the law. He didn't care about your feelings or your traditions. He cared about the results. He standardized weights, measures, and even the width of axle carts so that the empire would run like a machine. If you got in the way of that machine, you were removed. This led to the famous buried scholars incident. He didn't do it just to be mean. He did it because he believed that looking back at the good old days was a distraction from building a powerful future. He wanted a nation of workers and soldiers, not philosophers. His intensity was born from a desire for a perfect, orderly world. But he forgot that humans are not cogs in a machine. The Moshi lords offer a different perspective. Their force was purely religious. They believed that the universe was a hungry place. If they didn't provide the gods with what they wanted, the sun wouldn't rise, the crops would fail, and everyone would perish. In their minds, they weren't being brutal, they were being responsible. The ruler was the one brave enough to carry out the necessary, dark tasks to keep the world turning. This highlights a key difference between the ancient and modern worlds. Back then, the line between politics and religion didn't exist. To disobey the king was to invite the wrath of the heavens. Akhenaten's Egypt shows us the danger of a ruler who lives in a bubble. By moving to his new city of Akhetaten, he cut himself off from the reality of his people. He lived in a beautiful, artistic dream world, while the rest of Egypt was in turmoil. His removal of the old gods wasn't just a religious change. It was an economic disaster. The temples of the old gods were the banks and the grain stores of ancient Egypt. By shutting them down, he destroyed the financial heart of the country. His intensity was directed at his own people's history, making him one of the most polarizing figures to ever wear the crown. King Ajatashatru of Magadha represents the classic tale of ambition. He saw the world as a ladder, and he was willing to step on anyone, including his father, to reach the top. His military innovations changed the face of warfare in India. But what's interesting about him is the psychological toll his actions took. Ancient Buddhist and Jain texts describe him as a man plagued by guilt, seeking out spiritual leaders to find a way to heal his troubled mind. It shows us that even the most determined rulers were still human, capable of feeling the weight of the blood they shed. The Aztec ruler of Fuitzal was perhaps the most successful in terms of pure expansion. He pushed the borders of the empire hundreds of miles in every direction. His reign also locked the Aztecs into a cycle of constant warfare. Because their religion required a steady supply of captives for their ceremonies, they could never truly be at peace. Every new land they conquered had to be kept in a state of terror to ensure they continued to provide the necessary tributes. This created an empire that was vast and wealthy, but deeply hated by all its neighbors. It was a house of cards held together by a single, terrifying man. As we move through history, we see these patterns repeat. The ruler who uses force to create order, the ruler who loses touch with reality, the ruler who uses religion to justify their actions. They all share one common trait: the belief that their will is more important than the lives of those they rule. This is the essence of absolute power. It's a drug that convinces the person holding it that they are different from everyone else, that they are exempt from the standard rules of human behavior. But there is a lesson in the end of these rulers as well. Ashurbanipal's empire collapsed only a few years after his departure, as the people he had terrorized for so long rose up in a tide of vengeance. Caligula was ended by his own palace guards. Qin Shi Huang's dynasty lasted only a few years after his passing before it was replaced by the Han. Akhenaten's city was abandoned to the sands. The Aztec Empire, despite its power, fell when its neighbors joined forces with outsiders to finally bring down the people who had kept them in fear for so long. Force can build an empire, but it rarely sustains one. In the end, these rulers are a mirror for our own history. They show us what happens when the structures of society break down and are replaced by the will of a single individual. We look back at them with a mix of horror and fascination because they represent the extremes of the human experience. They are the cautionary tales of the past, reminding us that the true strength of a civilization isn't found in its monuments or its conquests, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Think about the sheer logistics of some of these reigns. To build the Great Wall, Qin Shi Huang had to move millions of people, feed them, and organize them in an era without computers or modern transport. To host the ceremonies in Tenochtitlan, Huitzilopochtli had to coordinate the movement of thousands of people across rugged terrain. The organizational skill required to be a brutal ruler is actually quite impressive. It takes a brilliant, albeit dark, mind to manage that level of control over millions of people. We also have to consider the role of the people who followed them. A king cannot be a monster alone. He needs a court, guard, and a population that for whatever reason goes along with his commands. In many cases, the people supported these rulers because they promised security. In a world of bandits, invading tribes, and famine, a strong ruler, even an intense one, was better than no ruler at all. They bartered their freedom for the promise that someone was at least in charge. The story of the Lord of Sipon in the Moshi culture is particularly telling. When he was finally discovered in his tomb, he wasn't alone. He was buried with his wives, his guards, and even his dog. This tells us that his power didn't end with this life. His subjects believed so strongly in his divinity that they were willing to accompany him into the next world. That is a level of psychological control that we can barely imagine today. In Rome, the downfall of Caligula didn't end the trend of unpredictable rulers. He was just the first in a line of emperors who would test the limits of what the Roman people would tolerate. He showed the world that the title of Caesar could be a mask for personal impulse. His reign changed the Roman Empire forever, shifting it away from the ideals of the Republic and toward a system where the personality of the man on the throne was the most important factor in the world. As we look across all these civilizations, we see that brutality wasn't unique to any one culture or region. It was a universal human experience. Whether it was the cold logic of the Qin or the fiery intensity of the Aztecs, the result was the same: a world where life was cheap and the ruler was everything. But we also see that these periods of intensity were often followed by eras of great reform and creativity. The Han dynasty took the unity of the Qin and added a layer of Confucian mercy. The successors to Akhenaten returned to the old gods but with a new awareness of the pharaoh's responsibilities. History is a pendulum, swinging between the need for order and the need for freedom. What can we take away from these stories? Perhaps it's the realization that power is a massive responsibility that few are truly equipped to handle. When we look at the ruins of Nineveh or the empty temples of Egypt, we should see them not just as ancient history but as warnings. They tell us that greatness is not measured by the height of an emperor's wall, but by the legacy of peace and justice they leave behind. These rulers were the most brutal of their time, and as a result, their empires were often the most fragile. The intense rulers of the ancient world are fascinating because they lived in a world without limits. There were no international courts, no human rights charters, and no media to hold them accountable. They were the ultimate test of the human character. Some used that power to build, others to destroy, and most did a bit of both. They remind us that the human spirit is capable of incredible things, both beautiful and terrifying. As we conclude this exploration, remember that for every names we know, like Caligula or Akhenaten, there were likely hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who just wanted to live their lives, raise their families, and see the sun rise. The history of ancient civilizations is often told through the lives of the kings, but it was built by the hands of the people. The brutal rulers may have held the whip, but the people held the world on their shoulders. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the darker side of ancient history. We've traveled from the blood-soaked altars of the Aztecs to the silent libraries of the Assyrians, and from the desert cities of Egypt to the unified walls of China. It's a journey that shows us just how far we've come and how much we still have to learn about the nature of power. The past is never truly gone. It lives on in the stones, the stories, and the lessons we choose to take from it. Stay curious and always keep looking for the truth behind the monuments. History is not just a list of dates and names. It's a living, breathing story of who we are and who we can become. When we study the most intense rulers of every ancient civilization, we aren't just looking at the past. We are looking at a map of the human heart, with all its light and its shadow. Join us next time as we continue to peel back the layers of our collective history, exploring the mysteries, the triumphs, and the shadows of our world. The world of the ancient rulers was a world of fire and gold, of blood and stone. It was a world that produced both the best and the worst of us. By understanding them, we understand ourselves a little bit better. We learn the value of the things they lacked: empathy, restraint, and a respect for the dignity of every individual. These are the things that truly build an empire that lasts. Until next time, keep exploring the depths of our incredible human story.